morning. It's nice to see a large gathering. This panel actually was organized as a round table. And so we are trying to keep our papers a little bit shorter. A little bit shorter. Oh. And we will invite questions after all the papers, but then we also have some questions to try and create some dialogue. So I hope you will feel ready to participate. Day of Remembrance is rarely commemorated outside the Japanese American community. So I want to thank Kevin, fellas, for acknowledging this day and celebrating it as part of this symposium. Honoring February 19th is a reminder of the injustice incurred by the signing of Executive Order 9066 on February 19th, 1942, by Franklin D. Roosevelt. Allegedly for national security, the order authorized the U.S. Army to forcibly remove Japanese American civilians from the states of Washington, Oregon, California, and Hawaii during World War II. The policy unjustly separated and imprisoned 120,000 Japanese Americans, stripping them of their civil rights that cascaded in the loss of jobs, businesses, homes, farms, and farms, excuse me. Racially motivated suspicions of fifth column sabotage by Japanese Americans were a fiction, and no one of this demographic was ever charged. Let's see. I don't think the people in this room need a little lesson here in terms, but these are the terms to refer to the different generations, the three generations that are talked about in this work. My grandparents were Issei, my parents were Nisei, and I'm the Sansei writing about this. Jazz saves lives. Nisei George Yoshida's following declaration conveys the salience of music for an American teenager as he headed into a life behind barbed wire. The sign on the telephone pole ordered us to assemble nearby on Saturday with just our bedding and clothes, just stuff we could carry. I could not leave my records. Put about 50 of my favorites, Tommy Dorsey, Artie Shaw, Duke Ellington, into a case. Clutching my lifeblood, I sighed a heavy-hearted goodbye to East LA. Yoshida's resignation captures the rush and desperate preparations by his peers for their unlawful incarceration. Certainly not singular in his response, Yoshida's anguished unwillingness to leave behind his beloved recordings reveals the unwarranted disruption of Japanese American lives. For Yoshida and many second-generation Nisei, the sound of dance band music of the 1930s and 40s captured the hearts and minds as they sought to prove their Americanness. Art making was a stabilizing force for incarcerees as they sought to create beauty in a setting that denied them their humanity. I propose that jazz making provided a remedy for Japanese American youth against crippling social and psychological damage. The role of musicking was one of spiritual and cultural renewal, and in some instances, resistance. For performers and audiences alike, music ostensibly was a source of jouissance. It created social space that was familiar and where collective memories served to ease the humiliation and hardship. I apply the migration studies notion of immobility to the forced migration of Japanese American prisoners to 16 desolate locations in the US during World War II. The use of immobility here is an extreme example defined by the spatial setting of the camps, the geopolitical conflict between US and Japan, and the intense discrimination against Americans of Japanese descent. Wartime incarceration immobilized 120,000 people, placing them in 10 main camps and 6 Department of Justice camps. Within this context of displacement, I advanced the idea that jazz making spawned what I call symbolic mobility, which manifested in the agency exercised by Japanese American youth to reinforce their identity and create some sense of normalcy by learning and performing jazz. The element of imagination was at play. According to Jean-Paul Sartre, the imagination is closely linked with personal freedom as a means to escape from the world. Gail Wormersley's notion of alternative reality more closely applies to Japanese American youth as she explores the relation between imagination and trauma, specifically in the context of forced migration and how imagination aids in healing as individuals disengage from their circumstances. Further, Alexandra de Onofrio and Johannes Scherberg assert that human imagination, quote, is not merely an escape, but that it forms an essential part of the continuous process of crafting selfhood and concrete strategies for future mobility, end of quote. The idea of crafting selfhood for future mobility aligns well with the agency deployed by Japanese American youth in that the co-creative act of performing jazz reinforced their identity as Americans that they hoped would ease their future mobility. Within the 10 primary concentration camps, communities formed around various genres of musicking. A framework for describing these groupings is one based on Kay Chalamet's approach to thinking about musical communities. Chalamet writes, rethinking the notion of community opens opportunities first and foremost to explore musical transmission and performance, not just as expressive or symbols of a given social grouping, but as an integral part of processes that can at different moments help generate, shape, and sustain new collectivities. In defining musical community, Chalamet frees the concept of community from conventions of structure, place, or time, although she recognizes that both structural and local elements may be significant in the development of the community. Her emphasis is on the process of musical performance and transmission. She proposes, quote, a musical community is a social entity, an outcome of a combination of social and musical processes, rendering those who participate in making or listening to music aware of a connection among themselves, end of quote. Chalamet identifies 3 social processes as integral to the creation of musical collectivities. Musical collectivities based on descent formed around Japanese musicking, both traditional and popular, echoing groups that were active in pre-war Japanese communities. Shared ethnicity facilitated the formation of these groups based on descent and expressions of a Japanese heritage. Traditional arts teachers and their students performed their Japanese collective identity with cultural forms that demonstrated a shared diasporic consciousness. Within the politicized context of the concentration camps, musicking was an important avenue of resistance in dissent communities. Levels of dissent ranged from tacit to overt. Performing Japanese music to express one's heritage and personal preference was a tacit form of resistance that better suited Japanese inclinations toward indirect, less overt responses. Playing Japanese music or dancing buyo was more than just an enactment of a social process of dissent. Many individuals sought to exercise their cultural citizenship, that is, the right as American citizens to express and maintain Japanese cultural practices in response to the repressive conditions of the camps that as a rule discouraged anything Japanese. Choosing Japanese music subverted the War Relocation Authority's policies of coerced assimilation. Participation in this collective could be interpreted as engaging in a covert performance of difference. At the other end of the resistance scale in the dissent community were Japanese ultranationalists who used the cultural arts to reinforce a Japanese orthodoxy in building communal solidarity and preparing people to expatriate and repatriate to Japan. The political slant of artistic pursuits functioned to construct how inmates were to be politically represented, coupled with a deliberate aesthetic choice that challenged the dominant culture that oppressed them. Dissent and dissent communities seemingly overlapped in their choice of music, but their intent differed. An affinity community also materialized in each camp. Its members included mostly Nisei, who embraced Western/American music, classical, popular, and vernacular, as their social, cultural, and aesthetic preference. Members of this collective shared a strong affinity with performing, dancing, and listening, particularly to American popular music, linking them to American mainstream society and bolstering their identity as middle-class Americans. Age was also a source of affinity shared by members of this social cohort, many of whom were teenagers or college students. Applying three musico-social categories clearly differentiates the clusters of musicking in the camps. The three designations pinpoint socio-political orientations that accommodate a range of identities differing in generation, class, region, and political leanings. They also serve as guidelines in proposing correlations between socio-political and musical processes that evolved in the repressive circumstances over a 3-year period. An important feature of Chalamet's model is the capability of placing the three social categories on a continuum within the larger framework of the camps, a continuum that allows for the horizontal movement of members from one group to another in the context of shifting loyalties, attitudes, and/or political and cultural leanings, and the corresponding effect it had on their musicking. This flexibility is particularly important because of the fluid, unstable, and temporary conditions of incarceration. Social affinity among youth softened their circumstances, giving expression to the joys of socializing and creating an alternative reality. All camps had some semblance of a music program. Some even organized a music department, often in association with school activities. Shared musical activities were a demonstration of the Nisei's desired assimilation. The racial and political reasons for their imprisonment intensified the efficacy of American popular music for Nisei, enabling them to strongly stamp their American identity. Antithetical to their immobility as incarcerees, camp life offered Nisei opportunities to learn and play music, actualizing dreams denied to many due to a lack of time, resources, or teachers in their pre-war communities. Performing American popular music of the day gave Japanese American youth a sense of agency, a means to represent themselves as Americans and to counter being regarded as enemy aliens. Performing afforded Nisei a sense of mobility and activity that was intensely social, an avenue that neutralized their sense of loss in having their lives unjustly severed from mainstream society. Thus, the Harmonaire Band from Minidoka Incarceration Center enjoyed enhanced mobility as the only dance band in the state of Idaho, traveling to various towns to perform for war bond drive dances, high school proms, and dinners was considered by the musicians great. Just a chance to leave the camps, and so it goes beyond just the symbolic mobility into actual literal mobility, at least for these young people. Swing dance bands flourished in the camps. 9 out of the 10 main camps had one or more bands. If you look at the names of the bands, it really reflects that time period, 30s, 40s. They're really charming. As you'll notice, some of the camps had more than one. You'll see Tule Lake had 2 bands, Poston had 3, and these often corresponded with the size of the camps. Poston had 3 separate camps. It was really large. And then as you look down at Topaz, Topaz had, how many, let's see, 1, 2, 4 bands, yeah. And the only camp that didn't have a band was Aurora in Arkansas. So that was the only camp that didn't have a band. So it was very prevalent. This really gave young people an activity that saved them. The bands provided entertainment for talent reviews, graduation ceremonies, President's Ball, New Year's dance, socials for various groups, winter carnival, and junior and senior proms. In George Yoshida's words, the dance bands proved to be a lifeline. I think we, music makers at Poston, were a big hit because kids from the farm country, seeing all Japanese American faces, that was really something out of sight. We felt good, too, for the first time in my life, to play music that I really loved. It was great, so enjoyable. And you can see George, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th person from the right with the glasses and playing saxophone here. Although later on in life he played drums. So he was also able to play multiple instruments. Larry Nobori recalls playing in the dance band at Minidoka Detention Center as liberating. And this is the band, the Jivesters. I'm sorry, I've forgotten to identify the bands that we've been watching from Topaz. So this is Larry Nobori, I'm recollecting. When they, the swing bands, were performing at camp, they provided entertainment, but there was a sense of becoming free of the boundaries of being interned for one, being Japanese for another. Besides the recreational and social appeal, dances and music served as soothing agents, as Chicky White, a singer, shared. That was a time to forget you're incarcerated. It was a time to relax and enjoy the hour or 2 we had listening to the music and dancing. It was a very good thing for everyone. I loved it. I loved the music. I loved the atmosphere, the camaraderie with the musicians. That was my whole life. Performing jazz gave Nisei the mobility to transcend the War Relocation Authority's prohibitive regulations and to assert their identity and forge a sense of agency against the racism and fear that resulted in their imprisonment. Musicking advanced Nisei's sense of freedom from within, transmuting their immobility as prisoners. This study challenges the paradox of immobility and mobility occurring simultaneously. I propose that it reveals how both forms were present among prisoners. Thank you.